A German general lay bleeding to death on an operating table in 1943. His doctors saved him using a revolutionary technique. That technique came from a black American surgeon. Hitler knew. He said nothing. This silence reveals something far more damning than any speech he ever gave. In a field hospital somewhere on the Eastern Front during the winter of 1943, Wehrmacht surgeons faced a crisis they had confronted thousands of times before. A high-ranking general had taken shrapnel to his abdomen and was hemorrhaging rapidly. Without an immediate transfusion, he would die within minutes. The doctors moved with practiced efficiency, reaching for stored plasma that had been refrigerated and prepared days earlier according to protocols that had become standard across German military medicine. They connected the lines, began the transfusion, and watched as the general's vital signs slowly stabilized. He would survive to fight another day. None of the men in that surgical tent knew the name Charles Drew. If they had known it, they certainly would never have spoken it aloud, because Charles Drew was a black American. A surgeon whose revolutionary innovations in blood storage and plasma separation had created the very techniques these German doctors were using to save Aryan lives. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was happening across every theater where German forces operated. Thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers, SS officers, Luftwaffe pilots, and Kriegsmarine sailors owed their lives to methods developed by a man the Nazi ideology deemed racially inferior. The regime that had built its entire foundation on the supposed superiority of the Aryan race was silently, systematically dependent on the medical genius of a black man. And when confronted with this contradiction, Hitler and his inner circle chose the most revealing response possible. They did nothing. They said nothing. They simply pretended the innovation was their own and carried on. This is the story of how ideology collapsed in the face of scientific truth, how racism blinded itself to its own hypocrisy, and how one man's brilliance saved lives on both sides of the most destructive war in human history. Charles Richard Drew was born in Washington, D.C. in 1904, at a time when being a brilliant black man in America meant fighting two battles simultaneously. The first was whatever challenge lay in front of you. The second was the constant effort to prove you deserved to face that challenge at all. Drew excelled at both. He was an outstanding athlete in high school, lettering in 4 sports, but his true passion was science and medicine. He attended Amherst College on an athletic scholarship, one of only 13 black students in his class, and graduated with honors in 1926. The barriers he faced would have stopped a lesser man. Medical schools across America either explicitly refused to admit black students or maintained such hostile environments that few survived the experience. Drew gained admission to McGill University in Montreal, where he could actually focus on medicine rather than constantly defending his right to study it. He graduated in 1933 with Master of Surgery and Doctor of Medicine degrees, finishing second in his class. He completed his residency and then returned to the United States to teach at Howard University, one of the premier historically black institutions. But Drew wasn't content with simply practicing medicine. He wanted to solve one of the greatest challenges facing modern surgery. People were dying not from the injuries themselves, but from blood loss, and nobody had figured out how to store blood effectively. And the problem of blood loss had plagued military medicine for centuries, but World War I had made it impossible to ignore. Soldiers survived horrific wounds only to die hours later from hemorrhagic shock. Surgeons could repair damaged organs and shattered bones, but without the ability to replace lost blood, their patients still died. The discovery of blood types by Karl Landsteiner in 1901 had made transfusions safer, but it hadn't solved the fundamental logistical problem. Blood had to be transferred directly from donor to recipient, which meant having compatible donors immediately available at the moment of crisis. In battlefield conditions, this was nearly impossible. Throughout the 1930s, researchers worldwide tried to solve the storage problem. Soviet physicians experimented with cadaver blood. During the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, doctors on both sides attempted various preservation methods. Canadian physician Norman Bethune organized mobile blood transfusion services for Republican forces in Spain. But even his innovative approach couldn't overcome the fundamental limitation. Fresh whole blood, even under ideal conditions, remained viable for only 7 days at most, usually less. The red blood cells would begin to break down, clump together, and become dangerous to transfuse. Bacterial contamination was a constant threat. Transportation was treacherous. By the time blood reached the front lines, it was often useless or deadly. Drew approached the problem differently. Instead of trying to store whole blood, what if you separated out the components? In 1938, working at Columbia University's Presbyterian Hospital in New York, he began systematic research into blood preservation. His key insight was elegant. Red blood cells were the problem. They were fragile, prone to clumping, and provided the medium for bacterial growth. But plasma, the liquid portion of blood that remained after removing red blood cells, was far more stable. Plasma could still carry nutrients, fight infection, and most critically for trauma cases, maintain blood volume and pressure. Drew developed meticulous protocols for separating plasma through centrifugation, storing it under refrigeration at precise temperatures, and maintaining sterility throughout the process. His methods weren't just marginally better than previous attempts. They were transformative. Plasma stored using Drew's techniques remained viable for weeks, even months. It could be transported across oceans. It didn't require blood type matching for emergency use. It could be stockpiled. For the first time in history, life-saving blood products could be where they were needed, when they were needed. He published his findings in 1940 as his doctoral thesis, titled Banked Blood, A Study in Blood Preservation. The timing was extraordinary. Europe was already at war and Britain was desperate. The Luftwaffe was beginning the bombing campaign that would become known as the Blitz. British hospitals were being overwhelmed with casualties. They needed blood, and they needed it immediately, in quantities that traditional methods could never provide. The British government, in cooperation with the American Red Cross, launched the Blood for Britain project in August 1940. They needed someone to organize it, someone who understood the science and could implement it on a massive scale under urgent conditions. They chose Charles Drew. At 35 years old, Drew became the medical supervisor of the Blood Transfusion Betterment Association's pilot program to send plasma to Britain. Drew's organizational genius matched his scientific brilliance. He established collection protocols, standardized testing procedures, created training programs for technicians, designed shipping containers that could maintain proper temperatures across the Atlantic, and coordinated with hospitals and blood banks across the New York area. Within 5 months, the program collected and shipped over 14,500 liters of plasma to Britain. British doctors used Drew's plasma to save thousands of civilian casualties during the Blitz. The program was an unqualified success. His work caught the attention of the American Red Cross, which was preparing for the likelihood that the United States would soon enter the war. In February 1941, Drew was appointed director of the first American Red Cross blood bank. He essentially wrote the rulebook for large-scale blood collection and storage. He created the concept of mobile blood donation units, which came to be called bloodmobiles. He standardized every step of the process, from donor screening to final storage. His protocols became the foundation for how blood banks would operate not just in America but globally. And then in 1942, Drew was forced to resign. The reason was as absurd as it was cruel. The United States military, in coordination with the Red Cross, had instituted a policy of segregating blood donations by race. Blood from black donors would be marked and stored separately from blood from white donors, ostensibly to prevent the mixing of blood from different races. The policy had no scientific basis whatsoever. Drew himself publicly stated that there was no evidence of racial differences in blood. Plasma was plasma, regardless of the donor's skin color. But institutional racism overrode scientific reality. The man who had invented modern blood banking, who had saved countless lives and would save countless more, was told that his innovation must be implemented according to the racial prejudices of the era. Drew refused to administer a scientifically baseless policy and resigned from the position he had created. He returned to Howard University, where he would spend the rest of his career training the next generation of black surgeons. But Drew's techniques didn't resign with him. By 1942, his methods had been published in medical journals worldwide. They had been presented at conferences in neutral countries. They had been discussed, debated, refined, and most importantly, adopted. Because the thing about good science is that it works regardless of who discovers it or who uses it. Truth doesn't care about borders or ideologies. And by the early 1940s, the medical truth was clear. Drew's plasma separation and storage techniques were superior to everything that had come before them. They saved lives. And in wartime, armies that don't adopt the best medical techniques lose more soldiers. It's that simple. Medical knowledge, even during total war, finds ways to cross enemy lines. Neutral countries like Sweden and Switzerland hosted medical conferences throughout the war. Physicians from belligerent nations attended, presented findings, and learned from each other's work. Medical journals continued to circulate through neutral intermediaries. The International Committee of the Red Cross facilitated exchanges of medical information under the Geneva Conventions. German doctors, like doctors everywhere, read the literature. They attended the conferences. They saw the results Britain and America were achieving with these new blood storage methods. And they faced a choice. They could reject the techniques because they came from a black researcher, remaining ideologically pure while watching their soldiers die from preventable blood loss. Or they could adopt methods that worked, save German lives, and simply never mention where the techniques originated. The choice German military medicine made reveals everything about how ideology actually functions when confronted with reality. They chose survival. They chose pragmatism. They chose to use Drew's methods while maintaining the public fiction of Aryan scientific superiority. German military medical records preserved in the Bundesarchiv and examined by historians after the war document the systematic adoption of plasma storage techniques beginning in 1941 and expanding through 1942. The Wehrmacht established the Blutspenderdienst, a blood donation service that collected, processed, and stored plasma using protocols that were functionally identical to those Drew had developed. Training manuals for Wehrmacht medics describe centrifugation, separation, refrigeration, and storage procedures that directly paralleled Drew's published methods. Field hospitals across the Eastern Front in North Africa and Italy, and eventually in the defense of the Reich itself, maintained stores of plasma prepared according to these techniques. German medical journals from the period republished articles about plasma storage and transfusion, often without crediting the original researchers or carefully obscuring the American and British origins of the techniques. When citations were included, they referenced other German doctors or European researchers, creating a false genealogy of innovation that avoided acknowledging the actual source. This wasn't accidental. It was a systematic effort to maintain the appearance that German medical science was self-sufficient and superior. The man nominally in charge of German health policy was Dr. Leonardo Conti, the Reich health leader. An early Nazi Party member and SS Obergruppen for Conti oversaw civilian and military medical services. He gave speeches about the superiority of German medicine, the importance of racial hygiene, and the biological foundations of the Volk. He never once publicly acknowledged that German military medicine was using blood storage techniques developed by a black American surgeon. Neither did Ernst Berg-Grawitz, the chief physician of the SS and head of the German Red Cross, another convinced Nazi who should have known exactly where these techniques originated. The silence was institutional and complete. This wasn't unique to blood storage. The Nazi regime had constructed an elaborate ideological framework around Deutsche Physik, or German physics, which rejected Jewish physics, including the theories of Einstein and other Jewish scientists. Yet German weapons development, radar technology, and nuclear research all depended on the very physics they publicly denounced. When ideology conflicted with military necessity, the Nazis simply lied about it. They used the science while pretending it was Aryan in origin, or while carefully avoiding mentioning its origins at all. So what did Hitler do when his doctors used the black medics techniques to save German generals, officers, and soldiers? The shocking answer is that he did nothing. There were no orders to stop, no speeches denouncing the practice, no attempts to develop alternative Aryan blood storage methods. The regime that had built its entire identity on racial hierarchy, that had passed laws prohibiting everything from marriage to blood transfusions between races, that had convinced itself and millions of followers that certain peoples were inherently inferior. This regime silently depended on the medical brilliance of a man they would have sent to a concentration camp if they could have captured him. The hypocrisy extended beyond just using the techniques. It infected how German medicine presented itself to the world and to its own people. German medical publications during the war proudly discussed advances in battlefield medicine, including improved survival rates from trauma and blood loss. They credited German organizational efficiency, Aryan scientific rigor, and the superiority of German medical training. They held conferences where Wehrmacht doctors presented data showing reduced mortality from hemorrhagic shock. They never mentioned Drew. They never acknowledged the American and British blood bank systems their own service was modeled after. The lie was perpetuated at every level. Post-war testimonies from German military physicians revealed a quiet knowledge that many of them possessed. They knew the techniques were Allied in origin. They knew they were using enemy medical innovations. Some rationalized it as simply using the best available science. Others convinced themselves that German doctors had independently arrived at similar conclusions. A few admitted, decades later, that they had understood the contradiction at the time but saw no alternative. Soldiers were dying. These methods saved lives. National survival trumped ideological consistency. The Nuremberg medical trials, primarily focused on the horrific human experimentation conducted by Nazi doctors, also documented the conventional medical practices of German military medicine. Evidence presented included Wehrmacht medical training materials, supply records for blood collection and storage equipment, and testimony about battlefield transfusion protocols. None of it was criminal. It was simply standard military medicine of the era. But its very standardness revealed the adoption of international medical practices that the regime officially rejected. Every German soldier who survived the Eastern Front because of a plasma transfusion. Every U-boat crewman rescued from the North Atlantic and saved by stored blood products. Every Luftwaffe pilot pulled from a burning aircraft and kept alive with Drew's techniques. Each one represented a living refutation of Nazi ideology. Their survival depended on accepting that a black man had solved a problem German science couldn't, that the supposed master race needed help from people they considered inferior, that racial categories were meaningless in the face of biological reality. The pattern repeated across every domain. German industry relied on forced labor from supposedly inferior peoples. German physics relied on theories developed by Jewish scientists. German cryptography was penetrated by Polish and British mathematicians the Nazis would have considered Untermenschen. German military tactics were countered by Soviet strategic depth and American industrial capacity. At every turn, reality contradicted the ideology. And at every turn, the regime responded the same way. It lied, adapted in secret, and doubled down on the propaganda. But there's something particularly pointed about the blood storage issue. Blood had been central to Nazi racial theory from the beginning. The Nuremberg Laws prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and Aryans explicitly to prevent the contamination of German blood. Nazi propaganda obsessed over bloodlines, blood purity, and the quasi-mystical properties they attributed to Aryan blood. They constructed an entire pseudo-scientific framework around blood as the carrier of racial characteristics. And then when German blood drained out of wounded soldiers on battlefields across Europe, they saved those soldiers using techniques that proved blood is just blood. That plasma from any donor, properly typed and matched, works the same way. That there's no such thing as Aryan blood or Jewish blood or black blood. There's just human blood, and Charles Drew figured out how to store it. The irony was perfect and complete. The very substance the Nazis had mythologized became the vector for revealing their ideology as the lie it always was. Every successful transfusion was evidence against their core beliefs. And they couldn't stop using the technique because doing so would mean accepting more casualties, weakening their military and hastening their defeat. They were trapped by their own hypocrisy. Drew continued his work after resigning from the Red Cross. He became chief of surgery at Friedman's Hospital at Howard University and chief of staff in 1944. He focused on training black surgeons at a time when most American medical institutions still refused to admit or train black physicians. He became a mentor to dozens of young doctors who would go on to break barriers in their own right. He continued to research, publish, and advocate for blood donation and proper transfusion protocols. He spoke out against racial discrimination in medicine, even as his own innovations were saving lives worldwide without regard to race. On April 1, 1950, Drew was driving with 3 colleagues to a medical conference at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Near Burlington, North Carolina, he fell asleep at the wheel. The car left the road and overturned. Drew was pinned under the vehicle and suffered massive injuries. He was taken to Alamance General Hospital, where doctors attempted to save his life, but his injuries were too severe. He died at 45 years old. An urban legend emerged and persisted for decades that Drew had been refused treatment at a whites-only hospital and bled to death as a result. The story was emotionally powerful, depicting the man who had revolutionized blood storage dying from blood loss because racist policies prevented him from receiving the care his own innovations made possible. But the story isn't true. The witnesses and medical records confirm that Drew received immediate treatment from white physicians who did everything they could to save him. He died from injuries that would have been fatal regardless of treatment. The legend persists because it feels like it should be true, because it would be a fitting, tragic ending to a life defined by fighting against racist barriers. But Charles Drew deserves to be remembered for what actually happened, not for a symbolic story, however powerful. His actual legacy is more profound than any legend. Drew died in 1950, but his techniques had already become immortal. Every blood bank in the world operated on principles he had established. Every plasma donation, every storage facility, every emergency transfusion protocol could be traced back to his foundational work. The Red Cross Blood Service that forced him out continued to use his methods. The segregated blood policy he opposed was quietly abandoned after the war when its scientific absurdity became impossible to maintain. By the 1950s, the international medical community fully recognized Drew's contributions. Awards, honors, and posthumous recognition accumulated. The same institutions that had discriminated against him named buildings and scholarships after him. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from places that would never publicly acknowledge him. Soviet military medicine adopted similar plasma storage techniques during and after the war. British Commonwealth Medical Services codified Drew's methods into official doctrine. And yes, post-war West Germany continued to use blood banking systems built on protocols that had been quietly adopted from Allied medicine during the war. The techniques worked. They saved lives, and gradually the fiction that they were anything other than international scientific achievements became impossible to maintain. Modern blood banking has evolved far beyond Drew's original techniques. We now have sophisticated blood typing beyond the ABO and RH systems he worked with. We can separate and store specific blood components for different medical purposes. We can screen for diseases Drew never knew existed. We can preserve blood products for years using methods that didn't exist in his lifetime. But every single one of those advances builds on the foundation he laid. The basic principle that you can separate, store, and transport blood products for later use. That principle is Drew's. The organizational systems that collect blood from donors and make it available to patients. Those systems are Drew's. The recognition that blood storage is a logistical and scientific challenge that can be solved through systematic research and standardized protocols. That understanding is Drew's. When you recognize the scope of his impact, the Nazi hypocrisy becomes even more stark. They weren't just using a technique developed by one black doctor for a few battlefield cases. They were adopting a foundational innovation that would go on to save millions of lives across the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st. They were benefiting from work that would become one of the most important medical advances of the modern era, and they were doing it while simultaneously implementing the Holocaust, while murdering millions of people deemed racially inferior, while constructing death camps and gas chambers, while perpetrating the greatest crime in human history. The cognitive dissonance should have been unbearable. But that's the nature of ideological thinking. It doesn't have to be consistent. It just has to be maintained. The truth can be right in front of you, can be saving your life in the most literal possible way, and you can still deny it if acknowledging it would undermine the story you've told yourself about the world. German doctors could administer plasma stored using Drew's methods to wounded SS officers and never confront the implication. Hitler could be informed that German military medicine relied on Allied techniques, and never question what that meant for his racial theories. The propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels could know that German science was derivative in many fields and still give speeches about Aryan genius, because the alternative, admitting that the entire foundation of their ideology was false, was psychologically impossible for them. This is what makes the story genuinely shocking in a way that no dramatic confrontation or explicit order could be. If Hitler had discovered that his doctors were using Drew's techniques and had ordered them to stop, that would have been evil, but at least ideologically consistent. If he had acknowledged the technique's effectiveness but claimed they were actually stolen from German research, that would have been a lie, but an understandable propaganda move. But the actual response, the complete silence, the pretense that there was nothing to even discuss, that reveals something deeper about how totalitarian ideology functions. It requires the ability to hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously and never examine the contradiction. It demands that observable reality be subordinated to ideological necessity, and it produces a system where everyone knows the truth but no one can speak it. The doctors who used Drew's techniques knew they worked better than previous methods. The medical administrators who implemented blood storage programs knew they were based on Allied research. The political leadership who received reports on improved battlefield survival rates knew what was producing those improvements, and nobody said anything. The lie wasn't that they were unaware. The lie was the collective agreement to never acknowledge what everyone knew. This pattern of silent hypocrisy extended throughout Nazi governance. They preached autarky while depending on conquered territories for resources. They claimed biological superiority while their best scientists fled to Allied countries. They promised victory through willpower while their military strategy was increasingly desperate and irrational. They built their entire state on lies, and blood storage was just one more lie. Not particularly large or significant in the hierarchy of Nazi deceptions, but particularly revealing precisely because it was so mundane and practical. Nobody was going to die specifically because they acknowledged where blood storage techniques came from. There was no tactical advantage in the lie. It was pure ideology, preserved at the cost of historical truth. After the war, as the full scope of Nazi atrocities was revealed, this kind of hypocrisy seemed almost trivial. Who cares if they denied the origins of blood storage techniques when they were simultaneously murdering 6 million Jews? Millions of Soviet prisoners of war, Roma, disabled people, political opponents, and countless others. The genocide overwhelms everything else. But I'd argue that the small hypocrisies illuminate the large ones. The willingness to deny obvious reality about blood storage reflected the same psychological mechanism that allowed them to deny the humanity of their victims. If you can convince yourself that scientific facts are subordinate to ideology, you can convince yourself of anything. If blood can be Aryan or non-Aryan, despite all evidence to the contrary, then people can be worthy or unworthy of life by the same logic. The same cognitive distortion that produced the small lie produced the large crimes. Charles Drew probably never knew the full extent to which German medicine relied on his innovations. He died in 1950 before much of the historical research into Nazi medical practices had been conducted. He knew his techniques were used by Allied forces and saved Allied lives. He knew they were adopted internationally in neutral countries. Whether he ever learned that Wehrmacht doctors were using his methods to save German soldiers, I haven't found any record of him discussing it, but I think he would have seen it as validation. Not moral validation of the Nazi regime, obviously, but validation of his core belief that good medicine transcends politics and prejudice. That blood is blood, that plasma is plasma, that human biology doesn't care about the artificial categories we create. Drew spent his career fighting against the idea that race should determine medical care or medical capability. He opposed blood segregation because it was scientifically baseless. He trained black surgeons because talent and dedication, not skin color, should determine who becomes a doctor. He worked in a segregated medical system while proving through his excellence that segregation was absurd. And ultimately, his science won. Not immediately, not completely, not without tremendous ongoing struggle, but it won. His techniques were universal because human biology is universal. The Nazis could lie about where the techniques came from, but they couldn't make Aryan-only blood storage work any better. Reality had the final word. Today, millions of units of blood are donated, stored, and transfused every year using systems descended from Drew's work. When you donate blood, the process you go through, the storage facilities the blood goes to, the way it's tested and prepared and distributed, all of that institutional infrastructure exists because Charles Drew figured out how to make it work in 1940. When someone receives a transfusion after an accident or during surgery, the plasma that saves their life is viable because Drew solved the storage problem 85 years ago. His innovation has saved more lives than we can calculate. It's foundational to modern medicine in the same way that antibiotics or vaccines are foundational. And somewhere in the historical record buried in Wehrmacht medical archives are German soldiers, officers, and yes, generals, who survived wounds that would have killed them because Charles Drew had revolutionized blood storage. They went home to their families after the war, lived their lives, and probably never knew the name of the man whose brilliance had saved them. Their children and grandchildren exist because Drew was excellent at his work. The Reich that sent them to war claimed they were part of a master race. The reality was that a black American surgeon was better at solving medical problems than anyone in German medicine had been. That's what Hitler did when confronted with this fact. He pretended it wasn't a fact. He maintained the lie. He stayed silent. The silence is the shocking part. Because silence is how you reveal that you know you're wrong but refuse to admit it. If the Nazis had actually believed their racial ideology, they would have rejected Drew's techniques and accepted the casualties. True believers don't compromise. But they did compromise constantly. Whenever reality demanded it, they used the science while denying its implications. And in doing so, they admitted, in the only way that mattered, that they knew their ideology was false. They just valued the ideology more than the truth. Charles Drew died too young, but he lived long enough to see his work change medicine forever. He faced discrimination throughout his life, but he overcame it through excellence. He was forced out of the position he created, but his techniques outlasted the policies that excluded him. And without ever intending to, without ever knowing the full scope of it, he delivered one of the most perfect repudiations of Nazi racial ideology that exists. Every time a German doctor in a field hospital reached for stored plasma, every time that plasma saved a life, the ideology died a little bit more. Reality killed it, one transfusion at a time. Drew's legacy isn't just the lives he saved. It's the proof, written in blood and survival and undeniable medical outcomes, that human capability knows no racial boundaries, that prejudice is not just evil but factually wrong, and that truth will always reassert itself no matter how elaborately you construct lies around it. The general on the Eastern Front survived his wounds and went home. His survival was built on the work of a man his ideology said was inferior. That contradiction was there in every heartbeat for the rest of his life. He probably never recognized it, but it was there. And that's what makes the story genuinely deeply shocking. Not a dramatic confrontation, but the quiet, everyday way that reality contradicted everything the Nazis claimed to believe, and they just carried on pretending not to notice. Hitler's silence wasn't mercy or tolerance or even pragmatism. It was the sound of ideology collapsing and refusing to acknowledge its own death. Drew's plasma kept flowing. German soldiers kept surviving. And the lie just kept being maintained right up until the moment the entire regime collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions and crimes. Truth won. It always does, eventually. But the victory wasn't dramatic. It was written in medical records, in survival rates, in techniques that worked regardless of who used them. Charles Drew changed the world by solving a problem that needed solving. That his solution also refuted one of history's most evil ideologies was almost incidental. Almost, but not quite. Because there's something perfect about the fact that blood, the substance the Nazis had invested with such mythological significance, became the vehicle for proving their mythology false. Drew didn't set out to defeat Nazi ideology. He set out to save lives. But in saving lives universally without regard to who those lives belonged to, he demonstrated what the Nazis could never accept, that we're all just human with the same blood, the same biology, the same capacity to bleed and to be saved. That's the shocking truth Hitler's silence tried to hide. And it's the truth that survived him. If this hidden story shocked you, subscribe so you never miss when we uncover history's buried truths. Hit the like button if you think Charles Drew's legacy deserves to be known, and drop a comment telling me what surprised you most about this story. Was it Hitler's silence, the hypocrisy, or something else? I read every comment. Let's keep these forgotten stories alive.